everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today I'm going to be talking about a craft and revision tool, essentially a writing hack, but a long-form one. We're really gonna dig in here, and that is when to narrate versus when to dramatize. I actually got the idea to talk about this from Lainey Taylor. She did a tweet thread that basically set off like a lightning bolt for me, and she said that in fact it was an editor of hers who set off this lightning bolt for her, but she articulated this problem, this question, this struggle in writing that she has had to work on and that she has leveled up over the years, and I went, oh my gosh, that is the perfect way to describe a problem that I have seen in a lot of work, a problem I've had in my own work, and something that I think can really help crystallize and elucidate the show versus tell debate and problem for you so that you can dig in and improve your writing, improve your storytelling. So what does narrate versus dramatize mean? So narration is when you're summarizing or quickly describing something for the reader. Often you're going to narrate in the name of pacing. You want to give the reader information and move along from it. And then of course to dramatize is to write a full scene or dialogue exchange, really draw it out and actively show something happening. There is a time and a place to do both, and in every book you will do both. But what I really want to focus on and dig into is the problem that I see in a lot of novels, especially first drafts. Not just novice writers, really experienced writers can fall into this trap as well, and that is relying too heavily on narration, telling readers what happened, essential information, etc., instead of more vividly describing it and essentially delivering it to readers in ways that are going to engage them more. I think that narrate versus dramatize pretty clearly boils down into show versus tell, where narration is most closely associated with telling and dramatizing is most closely associated with showing. And if you've watched my video on show versus tell, you know that I demonize neither of them. I am someone who tends to do more telling and has to fight to show, and there is a time and a place for both. There is a time and a place for telling, just like there is a time and a place for narration. My problem with too much narration is this is when writers are delivering so much information to you via narration. They're skipping over a lot. They're using narration to tell you about characters instead of showing you what those characters are like. They're using narration to tell you about character relationships. They're giving you backstory, especially on these people and these relationships. Now, the aim, of course, is to give you context, and there are plenty of cases where using narration to give you context is perfect, but there are many cases where using it too much, this is what creates distance between a reader and characters and story. This is when you start to lose engagement. And the number one thing you want to do is make your readers care. You want them to care about your characters and care about the story and care about the conflict and the stakes and the tension. So the tip is to look for opportunities in your work where you are relying too heavily on narration, where you're narrating and essentially glossing over something where you could do a dramatic scene. You could dramatize a moment, and just a few smart choices of switching narration to dramatizing can completely change your book, especially if you were looking for spots and making these choices in your first act. Very often I find that writers are using narration to set up essential backstory, where if you use dramatization, they're going to make characters stick more in readers' minds. They're going to do essential kind of setup and engagement work, so then later on you can use more narration. You don't have to dramatize everything. We'll talk a bit about what happens when you over-dramatize everything, because narration is an essential tactic for writing. You do need to use both. Places where you can look to dramatize instead of narrate, especially when describing character relationships. Most often you're going to just get more mileage out of the readers caring for your characters and understanding your characters if you give them, if you show them an interaction, have a scene between characters instead of info dumping backstory. So instead of telling me, oh, I've been dating Charles for 2 years and, he was kind of, mean to me. He would snark on me, but boy, was he cute. I don't know. Instead, give me an intro scene with the douche boyfriend where, he's negging her and maybe another character is like, oh, he's the hottest guy in school. This is not good writing, by the way. It's just an example, but you see what I mean? Where instead of having your character say, oh, I'm dating this guy, he's kind of a douche, but he's hot, you can show that to me, you can dramatize it. It can be a dialogue scene. And in doing this dialogue scene, this introduction scene, you can show me character dynamics or school dynamics, setting dynamics, which is essentially world building, especially let's say that scene takes place by the lockers or in a classroom or in the lunchroom. You're also telling me something about social dynamics at school. You're telling me about the main character as well and how they relate to other people. You're giving me so much more information through a meaningful interaction instead of through narration. I've also seen this a lot with parents. Writers will just say, oh, you know, my mom's a drag, my parents don't understand me. No, show me a scene where the parents don't understand the YA character, the teen character. That's going to be so much more valuable and meaningful to me as a reader. And it's going to make the parents feel like real people, like actual figures present in the story who introduce stakes, because parents are there to complicate things for their kids because they don't want us to go on adventures. That's just like definitely one to look for. Now, not every character needs a dramatic introduction, by the way, but I do think when it comes to your essential core relationships in your book, that it is not a good idea to introduce characters through your narrating character, your main character dumping backstory on the reader. I just don't think that's as effective. And that's the other area to look for where you're relying too heavily on narration and should be dramatizing. Backstory. Now, a lot of backstory needs to be relayed in narration. It's almost a essential function of backstory, but every once in a while, what I want you to do is look for opportunities where you can have brief flashbacks. Now, as many of you may know, you gotta be really careful with flashbacks in fiction. They can make a book hokey, clunky, they can interrupt flow and structure, but every once in a while you can do an artful flashback. It can be as simple as your character, a quote repeats in their mind. They think of an awful thing that this person said to them. I'll give you an example from my book, Brightly Burning. Instead of having my main character say, my aunt was horrific to me and I hated her, I have her flash back, like when those key quotes ring in our heads, we all have that, something awful, something said to us that pops up into our brain every once in a while. I had my main character hear her aunt's voice in her head and have these awful thing that she said to her on the page, a line of dialogue with a little bit of almost like a flashback of how her aunt had said it and what she had looked like and how my character had felt at the time. It's the tiniest bit of flashback, but it's really a dramatization. It's not narration. I could have just said Aunt Reed was the worst, but that's not as effective. It's not as vivid and doesn't paint as much of a picture of this backstory that is essential to understanding a character and essential to understand what's going on now. And then in some books, you can actually do deep flashback if you really want to, and in many books it does work well. You could use a structure where you intersperse little snippets of flashback, chapters of flashback. You'll see this very often in like thriller books where you get flashbacks of the victim. So you want to think about this. When is it going to be effective to dramatize backstory rather than just narrate it? And then with big, important moments where your character should be feeling things and reacting to things, and you want your readers to essentially be in their feelings and really dig into the moment, look for cases where you're glossing over, where you are narrating a moment instead of dramatizing it. You'll find a lot of these in climaxes, kissing scenes. There are all sorts of places where you'll realize, I'm being very sparse on what is actually happening and what my character is feeling, and so those are definitely opportunities to look to dramatize. And now let's talk more about dramatizing and overusing dramatizing. So the downside of dramatizing too much, and some people's style is to dramatize more in their first draft rather than narrate too much in their first draft, is if you dramatize everything, most often your pacing is going to be an absolute mess, because not everything needs to be dramatized. A lot of things are just more effectively communicated through some quick lines of narration or transition, and so if you are dramatizing everything, you're gonna have to look for those clever spots. You wanna look where your pacing is dragging, where the book is getting boring, where things are repeating. Very often when you dramatize everything, you are repeating yourself in terms of character growth moments and character trait moments. Like, you only need so many scenes where you're demonstrating your character's weakness. Cut the ones that are dragging the pacing. You only need so many scenes of romance to build romantic tension. You just don't need them all. The way that I like to think of this dynamic of narration versus dramatization is you're going to look to switch narration to dramatization when you're trying to up reader engagement, when people aren't feeling connected to your characters and your stakes in your book. You're going to be looking to go from dramatization to narration when you have a pacing problem. And so of course, in many books, you're going to be doing both of these things. You're going to be looking for both problems, but you also might find that you have one problem more than another. So I think of it as like engagement, character engagement versus pacing. And finally, I just want to say that you shouldn't beat yourself up if you're doing either of these things in excess when you are drafting. What I loved about Laini Taylor's thread is that she stressed that over dramatizing everything in her first drafts is how she figured out what would work better as narration. She had to dramatize it and write the whole thing to know what was important to the story. And I think that's really common. I can really relate to that as a pantser. I have to write out everything so I can figure out what's actually important in my book. And I do indeed tend to over dramatize, especially in my middles. I think this is why my middles drag, because I have to work through the characters' emotions and where they are and what they're feeling. And then so often in revision, I have to pull back dramatization and switch it to narration. Same thing with narration. Many people need narration to just barf stuff onto the page. The narration helps them get a sense of their deep backstory, of character relationships, and then it's identifying those key scenes where it's dragging things down and it's putting distance between the reader, and you switch that to dramatization. You need to do both of these. It's a style thing. So mostly I think of this as a revision hack, a revision tool, but I do think over time, as with most craft related things, once you're aware of what you're doing, you can start to course correct when you're first drafting. Over time, you should get better at knowing when to dramatize versus narrate. So I hope this was as illuminating for you as Laini Taylor's tweet thread was for me, and I will link to it down below. It seriously unlocked something that I already knew was a thing, but just I love putting the terminology to it and conceptualizing show versus tell and thinking about reader engagement and pacing in this specific way. Let me know down below in the comments any questions you have, and give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. I really enjoy these kind of deep dive tool looks at writing craft and writing hacks, and I hope you do too. I'll make more of them. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.